Okay, so today we are going to use all that we've learned about meiosis and alleles to help us understand why we see these weird offspring patterns. And when I say weird offspring patterns, that's things like our little girl, our albino girl, that we're trying to figure out why she's albino when her parents are not. And she does have a grandma who's albino. So we figured out some things already. We already know that some traits are dominant. We see that you can have a pure parent that's purple and a pure parent that's white. And by pure, that means generation after generation after generation after generation we're purple, and after generation after generation after generation we're white. If we take these two contrasting parents and they have offspring, that offspring will show just one of those traits. The trait that shows up, like in this case is a purple flower, we call dominant. So right now I want you to think about why that dominance happens. Pause me for a minute and see if you have any ideas. Okay, I'm hoping that maybe you are thinking back to the very beginning of genetics. Hi, I'm in the middle of recording. That's okay, bye. And in that very beginning of genetics, we actually talked a little bit about skin color. And let's take a moment and review what we talked about then. If you remember, we used these lovely cell models. And in this model, this is our cell membrane. We had a nucleus. Inside the nucleus, we had chromosomes. On those chromosomes, we had genes. Now, these genes are very specific portions of a chromosome that code for a certain kind of protein. And there are different versions of the same gene. Those genes could be functional, or those genes could be non-functional. And when there are different versions of the same gene, we call that an allele. Now, so far, we've been indicating a functional gene by coloring it in, and a non-functional gene by making it an open square or non-colored in. And these are our different alleles. So when we think about our albinism example, we talked about that already. We said, all right, we know with human skin color that there are these colorless molecules or white molecules. If we have a functional tyrosinase protein, then that functional tyrosinase protein will convert that white molecule into a colored melanin pigment molecule. However, if a person is pigmented, what does that look like when you look at the cell model? Think about it when you have two functional alleles. What will two functional alleles look like, and what will two non-functional alleles look like? Pause me and think about what is going to happen here. All right, when you have two functional alleles, your colorless molecules go through the functional enzymes that are present and get turned into melanin colored. But when you have non-functional alleles, we do not have functional tyrosinase enzymes. Therefore, those white molecules do not get turned or converted into the colored melanin molecules. So, does anybody remember what happens when we have one functional gene or one non-functional gene? Think about that for a moment and make a prediction for yourself. Now that you've made that prediction, you might notice in our picture that when we have a functional allele, we have some functional tyrosinase. And with the non-functional allele, we have some non-functional tyrosinase. These colorless molecules, watch them, they can still get converted using the functional tyrosinase. So even though we only have one functional gene, when it comes to this particular gene pathway, one functional gene is enough. It is enough to produce pigment in this individual. So the individual with just one functional allele will look the same as an individual with two functional alleles. They will have skin pigment. They will not be albino. So now that we have reviewed some stuff from the beginning of our genetics unit, I want us to come back to our albino girl. I want you to use a model, these cell models, to help us explain this case. You have in front of you Big Ideas, page 16. And on Big Ideas, page 16, I would like you to think about what rules we might have for our model, showing the traits, how traits can get passed from parents and offspring. Again, reviewing the things that we've done in our previous units. What rules do we have? Well, we know that in meiosis, genetic material is going to double. And we know that it's going to produce gametes. Now, in meiosis, we would actually see 4 different gametes here, but there's only 2 types. We are either in both, all of those gametes are going to appear functional. So the only kind of gamete that can be made from this parent is functional, and the only kind of gamete that can be made from this parent is non-functional. Notice also how these gametes have half the genetic material that their parents do. The next thing we know about is fertilization. And in fertilization, the gamete, the egg or the sperm from one parent, combines with the egg or the sperm from another parent. And when they come back together again, we end up getting, after fertilization, the complete amount of genetic material from both parents. So notice there are 2 chromosomes here, and there are 2 chromosomes here, and there are 2 chromosomes in the final fertilized egg. But now this time, half that genetic material came from one parent, and half that genetic material came from the other parent. So after we've reviewed meiosis and fertilization, we can add some ideas or rules to follow to our Big Ideas, page 16. We know that each parent gives half of their genes to the offspring through meiosis. We also know that genes from the 2 parents are then combined through fertilization. Please write this down on Big Ideas, page 16. Now that we have some rules, I want you to go to activity 3.2, using alleles to explain patterns. And I want you to think about, why can traits skip generations? We know we've got this little albino girl. She has 2 non-functional alleles. We know she has a grandparent up here somewhere who's also albino, but her parents are not. See if you can use activity 3.2 to develop your own model to explain how we can get this albino little girl, remembering to follow the rules that we just reviewed. Pause me and come back when you've attempted this model. All right. Hopefully, when you were building your model, you remembered that some traits, dominant traits, only need 1 copy of the allele to show up. So we could have one parent that looks completely normal, they are not albino, and another parent who looks completely normal, not albino, but both of them have the allele, the non-functional allele. And they could give that non-functional allele to their child. All of a sudden now, if each parent gives one of these recessive non-functional alleles to their child, this recessive trait, albino, that wasn't in either parent, can show up in the offspring. If we use that in activity 3.2, we can demonstrate that in our model, making sure to use arrows showing the movement of the alleles from generation to generation. First of all, we know our albino little girl has a grandma who's also albino. So they're both shown as open squares, as non-functional recessive alleles. But This other grandparent could have 2 fully functional alleles. That would be totally fine. And if this parent had 2 functional alleles, and this grandma we know is albino, then their offspring would then have 1 non-functional allele from the grandma, who's albino, and 1 functional allele from the grandpa, who is not albino. But what about the other parent? Well, on the other side of the family tree, we could have 2 grandparents, neither of which that are albino, but at least one of them would need to have this non-functional allele hiding in there somewhere. So then their child, who happens to be one of the parents of our albino girl, would have to carry that recessive allele. Notice that allele, 1 copy came from this grandparent. The other grandparent could give a fully functional allele. So now each parent has 1 non-functional allele to give to our albino little girl so that she ends up being with 2 non-functional alleles, and she can have this recessive albino trait even though her parents, neither of them, have that trait. So at this point in time, this is a great opportunity to add to our common vocabulary that's on Big Ideas, page 19. I'm sorry, Big Ideas, page 18. We have talked a lot about phenotype, or what we see. And an example of a phenotype would be a purple flower or an albino little girl. That is the trait that we see. Genotype are the actual alleles an organism has. We've already figured out that there are 2 different ways to be purple. You could be purple with 2 fully functional alleles, but you could also be purple with a functional and a non-functional allele. Notice here, instead of using squares to represent our different alleles, we used letters. So I used a capital A to represent the functional allele for purple color, and a lowercase a to represent the recessive non-functional color of white. So genotype could be a big A, could be a big A, or a little a, little a. Alleles are the different versions of the gene, big A or a little a. We've been using the word pure to talk about whenever 2 alleles are the same, either a big A or a big A, little a. But now we're going to use a more scientific term, which is homozygous. Again, the prefix homo means same. That tells us both of these alleles are the same, either a big A or big A, little a. The opposite of that is heterozygous. Here our hybrid, which is the offspring of the 2 parents who are both homozygous, is going to get 1 capital A from this parent and 1 little a from this parent. That is considered heterozygous or hybrid, where the alleles are different for a gene, big A, little a. And again, we've been talking about the trait dominant, the one that shows up in this hybrid, or heterozygote. In this case, the dominant trait is purple. The recessive trait is the one that does not show up. So because we don't see white flowers in this F1 generation, we're going to call that our recessive trait. If you have any questions, please reach out. We are here to help.